Ever wonder what it was like to dine like medieval royalty? Forget those stuffy paintings of kings looking bored on thrones. These folks turned every meal into a competition sport, complete with more drama than a reality TV show. And it all started with the most unexpected status symbol, bread. You might think bread is just something you grab at the store when you're running low on sandwich supplies, but in medieval times it was basically medieval Instagram, a way to show off how fancy you were. And nobody was fancier than the kings who took their bread game very seriously. Picture King Henry VIII sitting down for breakfast and probably complaining about wife number whatever. And what's the first thing he reaches for? A slice of the whitest, fluffiest bread you've ever seen. Not because he was craving carbs, but because white bread was the medieval equivalent of having the latest iPhone. The whiter your bread, the more important you were. Simple as that. And these royal bread enthusiasts didn't mess around with portion sizes either. Medieval kings could demolish up to 2 pounds of bread every single day. That's like eating an entire modern loaf for breakfast and saying, what's for lunch? While peasants were stuck munching on dark, rough rye bread that probably tasted like something you'd use to patch a roof, kings were living their best lives with bread so refined it practically floated off the plate. And it's interesting how medieval bakers had to follow strict rules about bread quality. If you were caught selling subpar bread to the king, you weren't getting a bad Yelp review. You were getting a one-way ticket to the dungeon. Some bakers even tried to cheat by mixing cheaper flour into the royal bread, which was about as smart as trying to convince a king his crown was made of chocolate. Kings would sometimes host bread tastings, where they'd sample different types of bread like modern-day wine connoisseurs. Yes, this loaf has subtle notes of wheat with a cheeky hint of yeast. Simply magnificent. I can just imagine a bunch of medieval nobles standing around nodding seriously while internally thinking about what's for dinner. But even with all their fancy white bread, medieval kings still had one major food obsession that made bread look like a casual fling: their absolute mania for pies. And let me tell you, these weren't your grandmother's apple pies, because we're talking about pies that would make Gordon Ramsay's jaw drop if he wasn't too busy yelling, "It's raw," at some poor medieval chef. Let's get one thing straight. Medieval royal pies were basically the Broadway shows of their time. Chefs would spend days creating these elaborate pastry masterpieces, some standing several feet tall. And the fillings? Everything from spiced fruits to entire animals. Yes, you heard that right, entire animals. They'd take a peacock, cook it, then stuff it back into its own feathers before baking it in a pie. Talk about playing with your food, but some pies were designed to literally put on a show. Imagine being a guest at a royal feast, cutting into what looks like a normal pie, and suddenly live birds start flying out. It's like a medieval version of a gender reveal party, except instead of blue or pink powder, you get a face full of startled doves. I bet that's one way to keep dinner conversations interesting. Hey, remember that time Earl Jeffrey got attacked by a pie? And it's ridiculous that these surprise pies became such a hit that kings started competing to see who could create the most outrageous ones. One king, who clearly had too much time on his hands, ordered a pie that contained a full band of musicians, actual people playing instruments inside a giant pie crust. Just imagine being those poor musicians, crouching inside a hot pie crust, waiting for their cue. That's definitely not what they covered in medieval music school. And the size of these things? We're talking about pies so massive they needed their own carts to wheel them into the dining hall. There are records of a Christmas pie made for King Henry VI that contained 2 bushels of flour, 20 pounds of butter, and enough meat to feed an entire village. It's like the medieval equivalent of ordering every item on the McDonald's menu, except with more pastry and fewer regrets. But even with all these elaborate pie shenanigans, nothing could compare to the medieval king's absolute obsession with meat. And when I say obsession, I mean the kind that makes modern-day meat lovers look like casual fans. Because these royal carnivores consumed over 100 different types of meat each year, from the usual suspects like beef and pork to animals we'd probably call pets today. The absolute rock star of medieval feasts, the peacock. Kings would demand these beautiful birds be roasted, then carefully reassembled with all their feathers back on, making them look alive. Because apparently, regular dead food wasn't fancy enough. They'd even add gold leaf to the beak because nothing says, "I'm rich," like eating metal. It's the medieval equivalent of putting edible glitter on your birthday cake, except way more expensive and probably worse for your teeth. But it's crazy how swan was considered such a luxury meat that you literally needed a royal license to eat it. That's right, there was actually swan paperwork. Imagine getting pulled over by the medieval food police. "Sir, do you have a license for that swan sandwich?" Some kings were so protective of their swan-eating rights that they had their own special swan marks, like a medieval trademark for birds. During big feasts, kings would serve up animals dressed as other animals. They'd stuff a pig inside a deer inside a cow, creating what they called a cockentrice, basically the medieval version of a turducken, but more likely to give you nightmares. And let's not forget about the boar's head, which they'd parade around the dining hall like it had won a beauty contest. But quantity was just as important as quality. Records show that King Richard II's kitchen would prepare around 8,000 sheep, 2,000 pigs, and 1,000 oxen every year. That's enough meat to feed a small army, which, to be fair, they often had to do. The kitchen staff must have looked like a medieval version of a CrossFit gym, just lifting heavy animals all day instead of weights. Of course, even kings couldn't eat meat every day. The church made sure of that. On fast days, they had to turn to another protein source entirely, and that's where the royal fish ponds came into play. No meat on Fridays? No problem. These crafty royals turned their fasting days into epic fish feasts that would make a mermaid jealous. Ever the problem solvers when it came to luxury dining, kings didn't trust the local fish market like common folks. Instead, they built their own private fish ponds, basically the medieval version of having a swimming pool, except instead of splashing around in it, you ate what lived in it. These weren't your average backyard ponds either. King Henry I had a massive fish pond network that would make modern fish farms look like puddles. Some of these ponds were so fancy they had underground channels to keep the water fresh and special guards to prevent fish theft. Yes, fish theft was actually a thing. Medieval crime was wild. The menu, everything from local pike and trout to seafood that had to travel for days to reach the royal table. Kings would pay astronomical prices for fresh sea fish, which usually arrived, well, let's just say not so fresh. But hey, when you're trying to prove you're holier than everyone else while still eating like a king, you make do with what you can get. They disguise any questionable smells with exotic spices, creating dishes that probably tasted like a combination of a fish market and a spice cabinet had a fight. Some kings got really creative with their fish definitions too. Clever medieval chefs figured out that beavers could count as fish because they swim, obviously, and suddenly beaver tails became a royal delicacy on fasting days. It's like when your mom tells you pizza counts as a vegetable because of the tomato sauce. Same energy, different century. But it's interesting how the lengths kings would go to keep their fish fresh. They'd transport live fish in barrels of water, with servants having to stop every few hours to change the water. Imagine being the poor guy whose job it was to keep the king's dinner alive during a bumpy carriage ride across medieval England. Talk about a stressful commute. Speaking of stress, all this fish-focused feasting needed something to help wash it down. And while the common folk might have been stuck with questionable water, kings had their own solution. When it came to pairing their fancy fish dinners, medieval kings turned to something that would make modern cheese snobs feel right at home. Cheese wasn't just food, it was medieval bling, the kind of status symbol that said, "I'm so rich I can let perfectly good milk go bad for decades." Kings would age their cheese like we age fine wine today, except they took it to ridiculous extremes. Some cheeses were aged for 20, 30, even 40 years. By that point, the cheese was probably hard enough to use as a weapon, which might explain a few mysterious deaths in medieval history. Cause of death? Attacked by a particularly aggressive 30-year-old cheddar? Royal cheesemakers were treated like rock stars of their time. These dairy wizards had their own special rooms in the castle where they'd work their magic, creating cheeses with flavors we can only guess at today, and they guarded their recipes more carefully than state secrets. One medieval cheesemaker reportedly took his special recipe to the grave after the king refused to give him a raise. Talk about workplace drama. Different regions competed to make the most outrageous cheeses for their kings. One French region created a cheese so strong, legend has it that a king fainted from the smell alone. Another made cheese in the shape of castle towers, complete with tiny cheese soldiers standing guard. It was basically medieval food art, except you could eat it if you were brave enough. Kings would import exotic cheeses from all over Europe, paying absolutely bonkers prices for them. Records show that some rare cheeses cost more than a skilled worker would make in a month. Imagine spending your entire paycheck on a wheel of cheese. That's some serious dairy dedication. They'd serve these fancy foreign cheeses at feasts, probably while bragging about how much they cost, just like that one friend who won't shut up about their expensive watch. But the most bizarre cheese tradition? The cheese taster. A poor soul whose job was to taste the king's cheese first to make sure it wasn't poisoned. These brave dairy pioneers deserve a moment of silence, although after tasting 40-year-old medieval cheese, poison might have been a mercy. Of course, all this fancy cheese needed something equally fancy to go with it. And nothing says, "I'm royalty," quite like having a wine cellar bigger than most people's entire houses. Wine wasn't just a drink for medieval kings, it was their version of bottled water. Mainly because actual water back then had a nasty habit of making people desperately ill. When you're running a kingdom, you can't exactly call in sick because you drank from the wrong puddle. Kings took their wine so seriously that they built wine cellars bigger than modern mansions. King Edward III had a cellar that could hold over 100,000 gallons of wine. That's enough to fill a small swimming pool. These royal wine collectors weren't just hoarding any old grape juice. They had specific wines for specific occasions, like a medieval version of a mood ring. Got a victory in battle? Break out the special French red. Signing a peace treaty? Time for that fancy Italian white. Failed to produce a male heir? Better grab the strongest stuff in the cellar. Some kings got hilariously particular about their wine preferences. One French king insisted his wine be mixed with exactly 5 parts water. Not 4, not 6, but 5. He had a special cupbearer whose entire job was counting while pouring. Imagine messing that up. "My lord, I apologize, but I think I counted 6. Last words of many a cupbearer, probably. But it's ridiculous how they transported wine. They'd ship it in massive barrels called tuns that could hold about 250 gallons each. These things were so big, they needed their own carts and special roads. Medieval traffic jams were basically caused by wine delivery. "Sorry I'm late to the invasion, sire. Got stuck behind a wine cart on the king's highway." But kings would sometimes use wine as payment for services. Need a new castle built? That'll be 50 barrels of your finest vintage. Want to marry off your daughter to a powerful duke? Better throw in some of that special Spanish wine. It was basically medieval cryptocurrency, except you could drink it if the market crashed. And the wine tasters? These poor souls had an even worse job than the cheese tasters. They had to sample every single wine before the king drank it, which sounds great until you realize they had to stay sober enough to detect poison. Talk about a stressful work environment. But while wine may have been the king's favorite drink, their real status symbols were the colorful fruits that traveled thousands of miles to reach their table. If you thought overnight shipping was impressive, wait until you hear about medieval fruit delivery. Medieval kings had a serious fruit addiction, but not the kind you'd find at your local grocery store. These guys were after fruits that most people had never even seen. Oranges, figs, and pomegranates that traveled farther than most medieval people did in their entire lives. Getting fresh fruit to a medieval castle was like trying to deliver ice cream in the desert, a logistical nightmare that cost a king's ransom, literally. Just how precious were these fruits? Put it this way, a single orange could cost as much as a skilled worker's daily wage. Kings would have special heated rooms built just to grow citrus trees, medieval greenhouses that probably cost more than the average village. Talk about expensive hobbies. And when a king managed to grow his own orange, he'd show it off like it was his firstborn child. The best part was how they served these exotic fruits. They'd cover them in gold leaf, because apparently regular fruit wasn't fancy enough. Pomegranates were particularly popular because their red seeds looked like tiny rubies. Medieval kings were basically the original food photographers, trying to make everything look Instagram-worthy. Some fruits were so rare, they were literally given as peace offerings between kingdoms. Imagine avoiding a war because someone sent over a really nice basket of figs. There are actual records of diplomatic missions being delayed because the fruit gift wasn't ripe yet. Sorry about the invasion delay, just waiting for these pears to get soft enough. It's outrageous how kings would hire special fruit guards to protect their precious produce. These guys had one job: make sure nobody stole the royal fruits. Medieval crime prevention at its finest. Halt. Step away from the mango. They'd even have designated fruit tasters, which sounds like a dream job until you realize they were really just making sure the fruit wasn't poisoned. But even with all these fancy fruits around, kings still needed something warm and filling to start their day. And surprisingly, they turned to the same breakfast that kept peasants going all day, though their version was anything but ordinary. Porridge doesn't exactly scream royal feast, but medieval kings turned this humble dish into something that would make modern food influencers jealous. Forget about your instant oatmeal packets. Royal porridge was basically the medieval version of a fully loaded Sunday bar, minus the brain freeze. The king's kitchen staff didn't just dump some oats in hot water and call it breakfast. They'd start with the finest grains, usually wheat, because remember, these guys were too fancy for regular old oats, then transform it into something that would make Gordon Ramsay weep tears of joy. They'd load it up with expensive spices, dried fruits from their precious collection, and enough honey to keep an entire hive of bees employed full-time. But it's interesting how medieval doctors actually prescribed porridge to kings as a health food. Got a hangover from too much wine? Porridge. Feeling under the weather? Porridge. Ate too much peacock pie? You guessed it. Porridge. These royal physicians were basically running the world's first wellness influencer accounts, minus the Instagram filters and sponsored content. It's crazy how seriously kings took their porridge temperature. They had special servants called porridge tasters who had to make sure it wasn't too hot or too cold. Basically, Goldilocks with a salary. These poor souls had to perfect the art of testing porridge temperature without burning their tongues off because nobody wanted to hear the king complain about burnt taste buds all day. Some kings got super specific about their porridge preferences. One English king insisted his morning porridge be stirred exactly 100 times clockwise, then 100 times counterclockwise, because apparently that made it taste better. Imagine having that job, the royal porridge stirrer. Medieval job listings must have been wild. Wanted, professional grain stirrer. Must be able to count to 100. Both arms are required. Kings would even host porridge parties. Yes, that was actually a thing, where they'd show off their fancy grain combinations like modern-day baristas showing off their latte art. Oh, you simply must try my latest creation. Pearled wheat with imported figs and crushed pistachios. It's all the rage in Constantinople. But what really took medieval porridge from bland to grand were the exotic spices thrown in. And when it came to spices, medieval kings had a collection that would make a modern chef's spice rack look like amateur hour. Because in medieval times, spices weren't just food seasonings, they were basically medieval Bitcoin. A single sack of peppercorns could literally buy you a small castle, which really puts your $5 pumpkin spice latte into perspective. Kings would show off their spice collections like modern billionaires show off their sports car collections, except you couldn't crash a jar of cinnamon, though plenty of people probably got caught trying to steal it. The spice trade was so valuable that kings would send entire armies to protect their pepper shipments. Imagine going to war over some black dust that makes you sneeze. But that's exactly what happened. These spices had to travel thousands of miles, passing through dozens of hands, each adding their own markup until the final price was absolutely bonkers. It's like when you buy something online and the shipping costs more than the actual item, except medieval style. Royal kitchens had special spice masters who guarded these precious seasonings like modern banks guard gold. They kept detailed records of every pinch of nutmeg and grain of pepper used, because when your spices are worth their weight in gold, you don't let just anyone stick their fingers in the cinnamon jar. Some spice masters even had their own secret codes for recipes, medieval encryption before computers were even a dream. Kings would sometimes pay their taxes in pepper. That's right. Instead of gold coins, they'd hand over bags of spices. The phrase peppercorn rent actually comes from this practice, though nowadays it just means a very small payment. Try paying your rent in actual peppercorns today and see how that works out. And the variety. These weren't your basic grocery store spices. Kings had access to exotic stuff like galangal, grains of paradise, and long pepper. Spices so rare that most modern people have never even heard of them. They'd mix these precious powders into everything from meat to medicine, creating combinations that probably tasted like licking a scented candle. But hey, if you're paying castle prices for spices, you're going to use them on everything. But even the most expensive spices needed something to make them stick to the food. And while today we might reach for olive oil, medieval kings had something much sweeter in mind. Long before sugar became the sweetening superstar, Honey was the king's go-to golden goodness. Medieval kings treated honey like liquid gold, literally storing it in precious metal containers because they were fancy like that. They even had their own royal beekeepers, which might be the most medieval job title ever. These brave souls managed hundreds of hives, probably looking like ancient astronauts in their makeshift protective gear. But the thing about royal honey is that kings used it for everything. Need to preserve some expensive meat? Honey. Want to make your medicine taste less like feet? Honey. Got a nasty battle wound? Slap some honey on it. Medieval doctors actually knew what they were doing with that last one. Honey has natural antibacterial properties, making it nature's neosporin. Royal beekeepers had to get creative with their methods. They'd track wild bee colonies across miles of forest, climbing trees like medieval Spider-Men to collect the best honey. Some kings even had special bee gardens filled with specific flowers to flavor their honey in unique ways. It was basically medieval flavor engineering. Ah, yes, this honey has notes of lavender with a subtle hint of royal garden roses. Very exclusive vintage, only 3 bees worked on it. It's also interesting how they used honey in royal feasts. They'd create elaborate sculptures made entirely of honeycomb, complete with little beeswax figures. Kings would show these off at banquets until someone inevitably got drunk enough to try eating the decorations. There are actual records of a feast where guests ate parts of a honey sculpture that was supposed to be a centerpiece, proving that drunk people haven't changed much in 800 years. But the most ridiculous honey-related tradition? Kings would sometimes send jars of their special royal honey as diplomatic gifts. Imagine being a messenger traveling hundreds of miles on horseback, protecting a jar of honey like it's the crown jewels. One wrong move and you'd have to explain to the king why his special diplomatic honey was now all over your saddlebag. And so ends our journey through the peculiar pantries of medieval kings. From their bread-based bragging rights to their honey-coated everything, these royal foodies knew how to turn every meal into a show of power, wealth, and sometimes just plain showing off. Who knew food could say so much about someone? Then again, maybe we're not so different today. We just post our food pics on Instagram instead of hiring a royal food painter.